Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and in this series we're making a player progression system. In our last video, we set up our attributes panel so that you could add points, take them away, and hit cancel in order to reset the total. You could also confirm in order to lock them in, making it so that points become permanent. In this video, we're going to add a stats menu. We'll make it so that each time we add new points, it actually affects stats that will do things in-game. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Now our stats menu is going to follow a pattern similar to attributes in that we'll make a data class called stats. We'll have a stats slot that handles the visual, and then we'll just wire a couple things in the progression manager to connect it all together. This one's going to be much simpler though, as we've already done all of the hard work of laying a foundation. Now our stats class is going to be a pure data class, much like attributes was, so we don't need to be using Unity Engine. We don't want to inherit from mono behavior, and we just want to make sure that this is a static class. That way other scripts can access these stats nice and easily. This means that we'll have to get rid of start and update, as we don't have access to those in a static class. And then we can start creating our actual stats. We're going to make each of these static, and here's where you'll have to choose whether you want your stats to use decimals. For most of mine, I want whole numbers, so I'm mostly going to be using ints here, though I'll use one float so I can show you how that works. Now for each stat, we're actually going to make these into properties, which means they're going to be taking in a parameter, in this case attributes, and then they're going to use those attributes to yield a value. So here we'll use a lambda expression, and you can come up with whatever formula you want. In my case, I'm going to take the vitality attribute. I'll give it a modifier. In this case, let's multiply it by 5. And then I'm also going to have power just have a little bit of influence over my max health. So here we'll add to that the power attribute multiplied by 2. Now you can set up these formulas however you like. This is just an example of what it could look like. Now my next stat is also going to be an integer. I'll make this one attack damage. And this time I'm going to set it up so that it is mostly influenced by power. So we'll take our power attribute, multiply that by 2. And let's say that we also want a little bit of agility, so I'll just add the agility attribute with no multiplier. I'll do yet another static int here for spell damage. And at least in my case, I'm just going to straight up use focus with a bit of a multiplier. Now for my final value, I'll just show you how a float would work. So we'll do crit chance as a float. And this time around, I'm just going to yield attributes.agility, and I can multiply it by an actual float itself. So I could get really small numbers if I want, like say 0.05 multiplier. Now you can really add any stats that you want. However, these are probably the ones I think most people are going to want. And so they're the ones that I'll use as examples and show how to actually hook them up in our game structure. Now that we've got stats, we want to actually set them up so that they display visually. And so we'll make a stat slot script, which will be able to do things like set up the stat name and also show the current and preview values for that stat. Let's open that up. Let's begin by getting rid of our start and update method. And first of all, let's just make a public string, which will display the name of the stat in question. We'll then have a public TMP text called name text. For that to work, we will need to add that we are using TM Pro. And then we'll do another TMP text for value text, and one more for the preview text. All right, next, let's create our awake method. And here we just want, as soon as this object wakes up, for the name text's text to show whatever the display name is. So max health or crit chance, that sort of thing. We're then going to create a refresh method. And each time this is called, we're going to pass in a float for the base value and another for our preview value. Now by passing in floats, it actually just makes it so that we're able to display both floats and integers, so that's why I've chose that parameter. All right, so whenever we call refresh, we want to take our value text, so the actual amount of that stat currently, and set it to the preview value, and yes, we need to convert that to string. Now this might seem counterintuitive, but I feel like it makes more sense if we are changing the attributes that it actually changes the stat itself, rather than showing what the stat was before we made that change. Now next, we actually want to create our preview value. So here, first of all, let's create a float called diff for difference, and we'll just take the preview value and find the difference between it and the base value. If that difference is greater than 0, meaning we're adding a value, then we want our preview text to have a plus sign and then show what the difference is, how much it's changed by. We'll then cover the other two possibilities. One, that the difference is less than 0, in which case we want to have a negative sign before the difference. And finally, the possibility that there's been no change, in which case we just want to blank out our preview text altogether. Now back in Unity, let's go to our stat slot and open up the prefab. We can begin by adding the stat slot script, and then we're just gonna add the hookups. We'll make sure it knows where the name text is, as well as the value and preview text. Display name will differ for each slot, so we'll have to leave the prefab to add that. And now we can just come in and make sure that each stat slot knows what its name is. Here you can use abbreviations if you want to save space. So I'll use max health and do DMG instead of damage, and I'll also use crit instead of critical. Now we can run our first test at this point, and it's not going to be wildly exciting, but it should at least change the names. That said, we're not calling refresh yet, and so we don't get any number changes, so let's hook that up next. For this part, we'll want to do something similar to what we did with attributes, where we have a drop-down in our progression menu where we can put all the slots and then update them each time the stats change. Again, we've already done the hard work here, so this is going to be quite easy. First of all, let's just create an array of stat slots. We can call them stat slots. Now the progression manager already has a refresh UI section that runs when we change points or when we start up the game. So here each time it happens, we'll just call a new method called refresh stats menu. All right, let's go ahead and create that menu now. And next, we're just gonna have to actually set up a special case for each of our different stat slots. So for example, for stat slot 0, we'll call refresh. And remember, it needs to know what the base attribute and preview are for max health. So we'll just pass along stats.maxhealth and do the base value and then stats.maxhealth with the preview value. We can then just copy paste this for each of our other slots. And we just need to make sure to change the number as well as which stat we're sending along. I realize that if we used a generic stat, we wouldn't have to do that. That said, we don't have that many stats, they're not going to be changing, and so this system will actually work nicely and be really easy to edit in the future or add on to. That's literally all we need to do, since refresh UI is already being called each time we update a stat or start the game. It'll make sure that refresh stat menu just gets called along with it. Now back in Unity, we can go to our player progression script and we can lock it. We can then shift click to get all our stat slots and drag those on over. Don't forget to unlock your inspector at that point. That's literally all that we need to do for now. With that done, we can actually go ahead and hit play. And now when we get in the game, each attribute we add is now dynamically affecting the different stats, both the value and the preview value on the side. That said, we've got a couple of little problems. You'll notice that things aren't quite lining up and we're running out of space. This is a relatively easy fix, though there's just two things we'll have to do to fully take care of it. First of all, just to show what's going on here, if we go to our preview value, you can just see that the box is not big enough to hold a decimal value that has 2 decimal places. And if we make that wider, it would actually fit just fine. So first of all then, let's get out of preview mode, go into our prefab, and just make sure to make all of those slots a little wider. Now you may need to adjust now, as mine's not perfectly centered since I did that. So I'll just go to my stat slot holder and adjust the margin on the left just a little bit so that things line up nicer. Now that mostly takes care of the problem. However, you'll notice that when I add in my agility, I'm occasionally getting weird values with a ton of decimal places and a little 1 at the end. This is just a strange thing with the way that bits are sometimes handled in calculations, and it's actually really easy to fix. We'll just pop into our stats slot quickly, and down here, whenever we display the difference, I'm just going to add toString, and then inside of our brackets, I'll put quotation marks and an F1, which just makes sure that this float is limited to having 1 decimal place. If you'd like to have 2, you could put a 2, and if you'd like none, you could put a 0 there. With that done, we can now head on into our game, and now whenever we update our stats, everything's updating dynamically, it fits nicely. We can confirm in order to set those values permanently or cancel if we want to get rid of them. All right, hope you found this one helpful. I know it was just a short one, but in the next one, we'll actually make it so that all these values are wired into our systems so that we can see how these stats can actually affect gameplay. Hope to see you in that video. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.